The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, Mountain Standard Time, but what came through the speakers at Peterson Air Force Base made every technician in the room stop mid-conversation. It wasn't the usual chatter from training exercises or routine patrols. This was something else entirely, a transmission that would later be classified and buried in files marked Eyes Only, though its contents would ripple through every command center from Colorado Springs to the Pentagon. Control, this is Bravo 77, requesting immediate vector change to bearing 270. The voice was calm, professional, but there was something underneath it that made Senior Master Sergeant Rodriguez lean forward at his console. He'd been monitoring air traffic for 12 years, and he knew when a pilot was trying not to sound rattled. Bravo 77, Control, confirm your position and nature of request. Rodriguez's fingers hovered over his keyboard, ready to escalate if needed. Control, I have visual on unknown aircraft, approximately 15 nautical miles northeast of my position. Configuration does not match any known friendly assets. A pause. Repeat, unknown configuration. The duty officer, Colonel Mitchell, appeared behind Rodriguez's shoulder as if materialized from thin air. In the span of that transmission, the routine night shift had become something else entirely. Mitchell's weathered face, carved by 25 years of service, showed no emotion as he gestured for Rodriguez to patch the transmission to the secure channel. Bravo 77, this is Control Actual. Describe visual contact. What followed was 3 minutes and 17 seconds of the most precise, methodical aircraft identification report Mitchell had ever heard. The pilot, callsign Wraith, according to the flight manifest, described details that would later be confirmed by satellite imagery, details that shouldn't have been visible to the naked eye at that distance and in those conditions. But here's what made that transmission legendary in certain circles. Wraith was flying a routine training sortie in an F-16C Block 50, a single-seat fighter that wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the coordinates she was reporting. According to the official flight plan, she should have been practicing basic maneuvers over the designated training area, not conducting reconnaissance missions in restricted airspace. The mystery deepened when they pulled her file. Captain Marlo Wraith Kestrel, 29 years old, had been grounded from combat operations for 8 months following an incident in Syria that had cost her squadron leader and left her with a fitness for duty evaluation that read like a psychological profile of someone who'd seen too much. She was supposed to be flying milk runs, logging hours to maintain her certification while the review board decided whether she'd ever see combat again. Instead, she just reported contact with aircraft that, according to every radar system in the region, simply didn't exist. The investigation that followed would consume the next 72 hours and involve personnel from agencies that officially didn't exist. But it was those first few minutes when a grounded pilot broke protocol and changed the trajectory of her career forever. That would define everything that came after. Nobody knew it yet, but Captain Kestrel had just initiated the most significant aerial incident since the Cold War. The only question was whether she'd survive long enough to see how it ended. 3 months earlier, Marlo Kestrel had been the kind of pilot other aviators talked about in hushed, reverent tones. She'd earned her wings at 22, the youngest in her class at Vance Air Force Base, and had compiled a combat record that read like something from a recruitment poster. 18 months deployed to Syria, 47 combat sorties, and a distinguished flying cross that she'd never bothered to have framed. Her call sign, Wraith, had been earned during a mission over Deir ez-Zor, where she'd managed to slip past Syrian air defenses so cleanly that ground controllers had lost track of her for 14 minutes. When she'd finally responded to increasingly frantic radio calls, she'd been sitting directly over a high-value target that intelligence had been trying to locate for weeks. "Where the hell did you come from?" her squadron leader, Major Rick Bulldog Patterson, had asked over the comm. "Been here the whole time, Bulldog. You just weren't looking hard enough." That was vintage Wraith, confident without being cocky, precise without being cold. She had a way of making difficult things look effortless, which had the unfortunate side effect of making her superiors think she wasn't being challenged enough. It's a dangerous thing, being too good at your job in the military. Eventually, someone decides you need to prove yourself all over again. The end came during what should have been a routine close air support mission near the Turkish border. Bulldog had been leading a two-ship formation, with Wraith flying his wing, when they'd received reports of enemy armor moving toward a coalition forward operating base. The target area was complex, urban terrain with significant civilian populations and multiple restricted zones. Bulldog had been methodical, perhaps overly so, taking his time to identify targets while ground forces reported taking increasingly heavy fire. Wraith had identified the threat first, a T-72 tank positioned between two residential buildings, its main gun trained on the coalition position. Bulldog, I have eyes on primary target, requesting permission to engage. Negative, Wraith. Collateral damage assessment incomplete. Copy. But her voice carried an edge that anyone who knew her would have recognized as dangerous. The ground controller's voice crackled through their headsets. Any station, this is Hammer 6. We are taking effective fire and need immediate support. Repeat, immediate support. Wraith had looked down at the tactical display, at the icon representing friendly forces under fire, and made the kind of split-second decision that defines military careers. She'd rolled her aircraft into a shallow dive, armed her 30mm cannon, and put a 3-second burst directly into the tank's engine compartment. The explosion had been spectacular. The tank's ammunition had cooked off in a pillar of flame that reached nearly 200 feet into the air. The coalition forces had reported the fire lifted immediately, and the mission had been recorded as a tactical success. But Bulldog had been furious. Wraith, you were specifically ordered to hold fire. Copy Bulldog. Target was engaging friendly forces. I assessed immediate action was required. That's not your call to make. The silence that followed had lasted nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in aviation terms. When Wraith finally responded, her voice was perfectly level, professionally neutral. Understood. But something had changed in that moment. The easy confidence that had defined her career was replaced by something harder, more calculating. She'd saved lives that day and had been reprimanded for it. The message was clear. Her judgment wasn't trusted. 3 weeks later, during a similar mission in the same area, Bulldog had hesitated again. This time, Wraith had maintained her position, following orders precisely, even as the ground situation deteriorated. When Bulldog had finally cleared them to engage, the enemy position had been abandoned, and the coalition forces had taken casualties that might have been prevented with earlier intervention. The after-action report had been classified, but the whispers in the squadron had been loud enough. Wraith had been right the first time, and everyone knew it. The psychological evaluation that followed had been thorough and professionally devastating. The psychiatrist, a soft-spoken major named Dr. Elizabeth Chen, had spent hours trying to understand what made Marlo Kestrel tick. Her report had been a masterpiece of clinical language that essentially concluded that Captain Kestrel was too independent, too confident in her own judgment, and potentially unsuitable for missions requiring strict adherence to command authority. You have excellent tactical instincts, Dr. Chen had told her during their final session. But the military requires more than just good instincts. It requires trust in the chain of command, even when you disagree with specific decisions. Marlo had nodded politely, but internally she'd been thinking about the faces of the coalition soldiers who'd been wounded while she'd followed orders. Trust was a luxury that dead people couldn't afford. The grounding had been temporary, officially. She'd been reassigned to training duties at Peterson Air Force Base, flying basic proficiency missions, while the review board decided whether she could be trusted with combat operations again. It was supposed to be a chance to prove that she could follow orders, that she could be a team player. Instead, it had been 3 months of professional purgatory. She'd watched younger pilots struggle with maneuvers she could perform in her sleep, had bitten her tongue during briefings where tactics were discussed by officers who'd never seen combat, and had flown training sorties that were designed to be safe rather than realistic. But she'd also had time to think, time to analyze her own performance, to understand what had happened over Syria, and to decide what kind of pilot she wanted to be. The conclusion she'd reached was simple. She wanted to be the kind of pilot who saved lives, even if it meant breaking a few rules along the way. She'd had no way of knowing that her chance for redemption would come in the form of a routine training flight that would turn into something far more significant than anything she'd encountered in combat. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never see coming. The F-16C Block 50 Fighting Falcon that Captain Kestrel had been assigned for her training flights was tail number 910376, an aircraft with its own distinguished service record. Built in 1991, it had seen action in the no-fly zones over Iraq, had participated in operations over Bosnia, and had been upgraded multiple times to maintain its effectiveness against modern threats. To most pilots, it was just another Viper, the unofficial name for the F-16 among those who flew it. But to Marlowe, it had become something more personal. During her months of training flights, she developed the kind of relationship with the aircraft that only comes from hundreds of hours in the same cockpit, learning every quirk of its systems, every nuance of its handling characteristics. The crew chief, Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, had noticed the way Captain Kestrel interacted with the aircraft. Unlike some pilots who treated their jets like rental cars, Kestrel performed her pre-flight inspections with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her life depended on every rivet, every wire, every component working exactly as designed. "She's got good hands," Santos had told her assistant, Airman First Class Jake Morrison. "Smooth on the controls, doesn't fight the airplane. Some pilots try to muscle these things around, but she works with it." Morrison had nodded, though he'd also noticed something else about Captain Kestrel. She was quiet, professional, but there was something underneath the surface, an intensity that seemed at odds with the routine nature of her training flights. It was as if she were preparing for something more significant than basic proficiency maneuvers. The morning of October 15th had started like any other. Marlowe had arrived at the squadron building at 5:30 hours, reviewed the weather briefing, and conducted her mission planning for what was supposed to be a straightforward training sortie. The planned route would take her through the designated training areas east of Colorado Springs, where she would practice basic fighter maneuvers and air-to-air intercept procedures. But as she'd studied the charts and flight plans, she'd noticed something that hadn't been there the day before. A small notation in the margins of the restricted airspace map, a temporary flight restriction that had been implemented overnight, covering an area about 50 nautical miles northeast of her planned route. It was the kind of detail that most pilots would have ignored. Temporary flight restrictions were common, usually related to VIP movements or special operations that required clear airspace, but something about this one had caught her attention. The coordinates were unusual, covering a section of airspace that wasn't typically associated with military operations or civilian air traffic. She'd made a mental note of it and had continued her mission planning, but the notation had stayed with her as she'd suited up and walked out to the aircraft. Sometimes the most important intelligence comes from the things that seem slightly out of place, slightly wrong. The pre-flight inspection had been routine. Santos had done her job well and the aircraft was in excellent condition. All systems were operational, fuel load was correct, and the weather was clear with unlimited visibility. As training flights went, it was shaping up to be textbook perfect. But as Marlowe had settled into the cockpit and begun her engine start procedures, she'd found herself thinking about that temporary flight restriction. It was probably nothing. Most of them were. But it represented the kind of anomaly that had made her a successful combat pilot. The ability to notice things that didn't quite fit, to ask questions that others might not think to ask. She taxied to the runway, completed her final checks, and received clearance for takeoff. The F-16 had lifted off smoothly, climbing rapidly into the clear Colorado morning. As she'd leveled off at her assigned altitude and headed toward the training area, she'd felt the familiar satisfaction of being airborne, of being in control of a machine that responded to her every input. But she'd also felt something else, a sense of anticipation, as if the routine training flight was about to become something more significant. She dismissed it as wishful thinking, the desire of a grounded combat pilot to find meaning in mundane training exercises. 20 minutes later, she'd realized that her instincts had been correct. The temporary flight restriction hadn't been routine at all. It had been covering something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the airspace she'd been flying in for 3 months. The first indication that something was wrong had been subtle, a slight deviation in her navigation display that suggested her GPS was receiving conflicting signals. She'd initially attributed it to equipment malfunction, but as she'd investigated further, she'd realized that the interference was coming from an external source. That's when she'd made the decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of returning to base to report a navigation problem, she decided to investigate the source of the interference. It was a violation of her flight plan, a deviation from her assigned route, but it was also exactly the kind of initiative that had made her a successful combat pilot. She'd had no way of knowing that her investigation would lead to contact with aircraft that officially didn't exist, or that the next 72 hours would test everything she'd learned about flying, fighting, and the difference between following orders and doing what was right. The GPS interference had been intermittent at first, just enough to make her question whether she was experiencing equipment failure or something more significant. But as she'd adjusted her heading to investigate, the interference had become more pronounced, creating a pattern that suggested deliberate electronic jamming rather than random system failure. Marlowe had been trained to recognize electronic warfare techniques, both as a potential target and as a user of such systems. The jamming she was experiencing was sophisticated, designed to degrade GPS accuracy without completely blocking the signal. It was the kind of technique that would be used to create navigational confusion in hostile aircraft without alerting them to the presence of countermeasures. But she was supposed to be flying in friendly airspace over Colorado during a routine training mission. The presence of advanced electronic warfare systems in this location made no sense unless something was happening that she hadn't been briefed on. She'd reach for her radio to contact air traffic control, to report the navigation anomaly and request guidance. But as she'd keyed the microphone, she'd seen something that made her forget about radio procedures entirely. Approximately 15 nautical miles to the northeast, at roughly the same altitude, were 3 aircraft flying in loose formation. At first glance, they appeared to be military jets, but their configuration was unlike anything she'd seen before. They were angular, almost geometric in their design, with a radar cross-section that seemed to bend light around them in ways that made her eyes water when she tried to focus on them directly. The aircraft were moving at subsonic speed, perhaps 400 knots, but their flight characteristics were unusual. They seemed to change direction without banking, to accelerate and decelerate without any visible change in engine output. It was as if they were operating according to aerodynamic principles that didn't match anything in her experience. She'd blinked hard, wondering if altitude or fatigue was affecting her vision. But when she'd looked again, the aircraft were still there, still maintaining their impossible flight characteristics. They were real, They were in her airspace, and they were definitely not supposed to be there. Her training had taken over then. She'd activated her onboard recording systems, had begun documenting everything she was seeing, and had started the process of gathering intelligence on what was clearly an unknown aerial threat. The fact that the aircraft didn't match any known configuration meant they were either experimental aircraft being tested without proper coordination, or they were something else entirely. The something else possibility was what had made her reach for the radio. In her experience, when you encountered something that didn't fit your understanding of reality, the best approach was to report it to people who might have more information than you did. Control, this is Bravo 77, requesting immediate vector change to bearing 270. The conversation that followed would be analyzed by intelligence specialists for months. Every word would be scrutinized for clues about what Captain Kestrel had seen, what she'd understood about the significance of her observation, and how she'd maintained her professional composure while reporting something that challenged the basic assumptions of air traffic control. But for Marlowe, sitting in the cockpit of her F-16, the conversation was simply the beginning of what would become the most significant mission of her career. She'd been grounded for being too independent, too willing to trust her own judgment over established procedures. Now she was about to discover whether that independence would save lives or end her career permanently. The unknown aircraft had begun to change their flight pattern as she'd watched, almost as if they were aware of her presence. Instead of maintaining their northeastern heading, they'd begun a slow turn that would bring them closer to her position. It wasn't an aggressive maneuver, but it was definitely a course change that suggested they were responding to her presence. She'd found herself in a situation that no training manual had prepared her for. She was a single pilot in a single-seat fighter, observing aircraft that weren't supposed to exist, in airspace that was supposed to be routine. The proper procedure would have been to maintain her distance, continue her reporting, and await instructions from air traffic control. But Marlowe Kestrel had never been particularly good at following procedures when lives might be at stake. And something about the way those aircraft were maneuvering suggested that the situation was about to become much more complicated than a simple navigation anomaly. The decision she made in the next few seconds would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone in the airspace around her. She could follow protocol, or she could trust her instincts. 3 months of grounding had taught her the cost of independent action, but 8 years of flying had taught her the cost of hesitation. She chose to trust her instincts. The radio conversation with air traffic control had taken on a surreal quality, as Marlowe provided detailed descriptions of aircraft that, according to every database and recognition manual, simply didn't exist. Colonel Mitchell's voice had remained professionally neutral, but she could hear the tension underneath as he'd asked increasingly specific questions about what she was observing. Bravo 77, can you estimate the size of these aircraft? Marlowe had studied the distant shapes, trying to use visual references to gauge their dimensions. Control, estimated wingspan approximately 60 to 70 feet, length roughly 50 feet. Configuration appears to be delta-wing with no visible vertical stabilizer. Copy, Bravo 77. Any visible markings or national insignia? Negative. Control. No visible markings. Surface appears to be non-reflective, possibly stealth coating. There had been a pause then, longer than usual for air traffic control communications. She'd known that her reports were being passed up the chain of command, that people with security clearances she didn't have were being awakened and briefed on what she was seeing. The unknown aircraft had continued their turn, and she'd realized that they were now heading directly toward her position. The range was closing slowly but steadily, and she'd estimated that they would be within visual range, close enough to see details beyond basic configuration, within the next 5 minutes. Control, be advised, unknown aircraft have changed heading and are now approaching my position. Estimated time to intercept, 4 minutes. Bravo 77, maintain your current heading and altitude. Do not repeat, do not attempt to intercept or engage these aircraft. The instruction had been clear, but it had also been problematic. The unknown aircraft were approaching her position, not the other way around. If they maintained their current heading, they would pass within a few hundred feet of her aircraft, close enough to be considered a collision hazard, close enough to be a threat to her safety. She'd been about to respond when something had happened that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The three unknown aircraft had suddenly accelerated, going from subsonic flight to what appeared to be supersonic speed without any visible change in their configuration. There had been no sonic boom, no exhaust plume, no indication of conventional propulsion systems engaging. But most significantly, they'd separated. Instead of maintaining their formation, they'd spread out in a tactical pattern that she'd recognized immediately. It was a classic intercept formation, designed to approach a target from multiple vectors and prevent escape. She was the target. Control, this is Bravo 77. Unknown aircraft have separated and are approaching from multiple vectors. I am being intercepted. The calm professionalism in her voice had been at odds with the adrenaline surge she'd felt as she'd realized the implications of what was happening. She was a single pilot in a single aircraft, being approached by three unknown aircraft with flight characteristics that exceeded anything in her experience. Her training had kicked in automatically. She'd begun evasive maneuvers, changing her heading and altitude to avoid being trapped by the approaching aircraft. The F-16 had responded immediately, its engine spooling up to full power as she'd pushed the throttle forward. But even as she'd maneuvered, she'd maintained her radio contact with air traffic control. Control, I am taking evasive action to avoid intercept. Request immediate support. Bravo 77, maintain radio contact. Support is being scrambled. The next few minutes had been a masterclass in tactical flying. The unknown aircraft had demonstrated capabilities that challenged everything she'd understood about aerodynamics and propulsion. They'd matched her every maneuver, had anticipated her tactics, and had gradually closed the distance despite her best efforts to maintain separation. But they hadn't attacked. Instead, they'd positioned themselves in a formation that suggested they were trying to guide her toward a specific heading. It was almost as if they were hurting her, using their superior performance to limit her options without actually engaging her aircraft. The realization had been disturbing. These weren't random aircraft that had stumbled into her airspace. They were operating with a specific objective, and that objective seemed to involve her. The question was whether she was being guided toward safety or toward something far more dangerous. And with her fuel state decreasing and no friendly aircraft in sight, she'd realized that she might not have much choice in the matter. The unknown aircraft had demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that suggested they were being flown by experienced pilots, not automated systems. Their maneuvers had been precise but not robotic, creative but not random. It was the kind of flying that came from years of training and combat experience. But it was also flying that violated everything she'd understood about physics and engineering. The aircraft were performing maneuvers that should have been impossible, maintaining flight characteristics that didn't match any known technology. It was as if they were operating according to completely different rules than the ones that governed conventional aircraft. As the intercept had continued, Marlowe had found herself studying the aircraft more carefully, trying to understand what she was seeing. The surfaces weren't just non-reflective. They seemed to bend light in ways that made the aircraft difficult to track visually. The propulsion systems showed no visible exhaust, no heat signature that would indicate conventional jet engines. Most disturbing of all, the aircraft seemed to be reading her intentions. Every time she prepared to change heading or altitude, they'd adjusted their positions to counter her move before she'd actually made it. It was as if they had access to her flight controls, or as if they could predict her actions with uncanny accuracy. The radio had crackled with increasing urgency as air traffic control had tried to coordinate a response. Bravo 77, be advised, Falcon 11 and Falcon 12 are airborne and vectoring to your position. Estimated time of arrival, 12 minutes. 12 minutes. In air combat, 12 minutes was an eternity. The unknown aircraft could complete their intercept, achieve whatever objective they were pursuing, and be long gone before help arrived. But Marlowe had also realized something else. The aircraft were being careful not to threaten her directly. They were maintaining a safe distance, weren't targeting her with any weapons systems, and seemed to be trying to avoid any actions that might be interpreted as hostile. It was almost as if they were following rules of engagement that prioritized avoiding conflict. The thought had been both reassuring and disturbing. If they'd wanted to destroy her aircraft, they'd had multiple opportunities to do so. Their superior performance would have made it a simple matter to position themselves for an attack. Instead, they were maintaining a tactical formation that suggested they wanted to communicate, not fight. But communication with aircraft that weren't supposed to exist was a problem that hadn't been covered in any training manual. How do you establish contact with something that officially doesn't exist? How do you interpret the actions of aircraft that operate according to unknown principles? She'd been contemplating these questions when the lead aircraft had done something that changed everything. It had moved to a position directly ahead of her, perhaps a mile away, and had begun to flash what appeared to be navigation lights in a pattern that was clearly deliberate. The pattern had been short, long, short, the letter R in Morse code. Then it had repeated the pattern over and over until she'd been certain of what she was seeing. R for Roger, the military acknowledgement that a message had been received and understood. They were trying to communicate with her, using a system that any military pilot would recognize. The question was, what were they trying to tell her they understood? The Morse code communication had opened a channel that Marlowe hadn't expected. She'd responded by flashing her own navigation lights in the pattern for A. For had watched as the lead aircraft had immediately changed its light pattern to spell out what appeared to be coordinates. The coordinates had been precise, down to minutes and seconds of latitude and longitude, and had referenced a location approximately 20 miles to the northwest of her current position. It was an area she'd flown over many times during her training flights, but she'd never seen anything there except empty terrain. As she'd copied down the coordinates on her kneeboard, she'd realized that the unknown aircraft were no longer trying to intercept her. Instead, they were maintaining a parallel course, as if they were escorting her toward the coordinates they'd transmitted. It was a complete change in their tactical behavior, from aggressive intercept to protective escort. The radio had crackled again with updates from air traffic control. Bravo 77, what is your current status? Control, unknown aircraft have established communications via light signals and have transmitted coordinates. They appear to be requesting that I proceed to a specific location. Bravo 77, do not comply with any instructions from unknown aircraft. Maintain your current heading and prepare to be joined by friendly aircraft. The instruction had been clear, but it had also created a tactical dilemma. The unknown aircraft had demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded her own. If they'd wanted to force her to comply with their instructions, they had the performance advantage to do so. The fact that they were using light signals and maintaining a respectful distance suggested they were trying to avoid conflict. But following their instructions would mean deviating from her assigned flight path, violating air traffic control instructions, and potentially putting herself in even greater danger. It was the kind of decision that had gotten her grounded once before, choosing to trust her tactical judgment over established procedures. The coordinates they transmitted were in an area that was officially designated as empty wilderness, but she'd noticed during her months of training flights that it was also covered by a permanent restriction on low-level flight. Aircraft were required to maintain a minimum altitude of 5,000 feet above ground level when transiting the area, a restriction that was unusual for terrain that showed no significant military installations or civilian infrastructure. As she'd studied her navigation display, she'd realized that the coordinates were at the exact center of that restricted area. Whatever the unknown aircraft wanted to show her, it was something that was normally kept hidden from aerial observation. The decision she made in the next few seconds would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone who might be affected by whatever was hidden at those coordinates. She could follow air traffic control instructions, maintain her heading, and await the arrival of friendly aircraft. Or she could trust the unknown aircraft, trust that their apparent attempt at communication was genuine, and investigate what they were trying to show her. Her training said one thing, her instincts said another, and somewhere in the distance, friendly aircraft were racing toward her position, ready to engage targets that might not be hostile at all. The choice was hers, and she had less than a minute to make it. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Marlowe had built her career on the principle that information was the key to survival, that understanding the tactical situation was more important than following procedures that might not apply to the current circumstances. The unknown aircraft had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in her experience, but they'd also demonstrated restraint and an apparent desire to communicate rather than fight. Control, this is Bravo 77. I am proceeding to investigate the coordinates transmitted by unknown aircraft. My intention is to gather intelligence on their purpose and capabilities. The response had been immediate and predictable. Bravo 77, you are ordered to maintain your current heading. Do not deviate from your assigned flight path. But Marlowe had already begun her turn toward the northwest, toward the coordinates that the unknown aircraft had transmitted. The F-16 had responded smoothly, its navigation systems calculating a new course toward the restricted area that she'd flown over dozens of times without truly seeing. The unknown aircraft had maintained their escort position, but she'd noticed that they'd also changed their formation slightly. Instead of the aggressive intercept pattern they'd used initially, they'd moved to a more protective formation, as if they were shielding her from potential threats rather than threatening her themselves. The radio had erupted with increasingly urgent transmissions from air traffic control, but she'd maintained her course toward the coordinates. She'd crossed the boundary of the restricted area at precisely 400 hours, and had immediately understood why the area had been designated as off-limits to low-level flight. Below her, hidden in what appeared to be a natural valley, was a complex of buildings and structures that didn't appear on any chart or satellite image she'd ever seen. The complex was extensive, covering several square miles, and was clearly designed to be invisible from aerial observation. Buildings were constructed to blend with the terrain, and what appeared to be natural rock formations were actually camouflage structures. But most significantly, the complex was active. She could see vehicles moving between buildings, aircraft on what appeared to be a runway, and clear signs of ongoing operations. It was a major military installation that had been hidden so effectively that it was invisible to normal aerial reconnaissance. The unknown aircraft had led her directly to it, and as she'd circled the area at 8,000 feet, she'd realized that they were showing her something that someone had gone to enormous lengths to keep secret. The question was, why? The answer had come in the form of additional aircraft rising from the complex below. These weren't unknown aircraft with mysterious capabilities. These were conventional military aircraft, F-22 Raptors, she'd thought, but their markings were unlike anything she'd seen before. They were solid black, with no national insignia, no squadron markings, no identification of any kind. The unmarked aircraft had joined the escort formation, and suddenly she'd found herself surrounded by conventional and unconventional aircraft, all apparently operating from the same secret facility. It was as if she'd stumbled into a classified program that combined known and unknown technologies, operated by people who had reasons for keeping their activities hidden from normal military oversight. The radio had crackled with a new voice, one that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Bravo 77, this is Blackbird Control. You are ordered to follow the lead aircraft to runway 27 for immediate landing. The voice had been calm, professional, but there had been an undertone that suggested noncompliance would not be tolerated. She'd found herself in a situation that no training manual had prepared her for, being ordered to land at a facility that officially didn't exist, by people who weren't supposed to be there. But she'd also realized that she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. She'd seen too much, learned too much, to simply fly away and pretend that nothing had happened. Whatever was happening at this facility, she was now part of it, whether she'd intended to be or not. The landing had been surreal. The runway was longer than anything she'd seen outside of major air bases, and the facility's ground control had guided her through an approach that was precise and professional. The unknown aircraft had landed first, touching down with the same impossible grace they demonstrated in flight, while the unmarked conventional aircraft had formed a protective circle around the runway. As she taxied to the designated parking area, she'd seen personnel in military uniforms but without visible rank or unit insignia. They'd moved with the efficiency of elite forces, but their equipment and procedures were unlike anything in her experience. It was as if she'd landed at a base that existed in parallel to the military she'd known, operating according to different rules and different objectives. The engine had wound down, and she'd begun her post-flight procedures with the mechanical precision that came from years of training. But she'd also been acutely aware that everything had changed. She was no longer Captain Marlowe Kestrel, grounded fighter pilot flying training missions. She was now a witness to something that challenged everything she'd understood about military operations, about the nature of the aircraft she'd been trained to fly, and about the limits of human technology. The question was, what would they do with a witness who'd seen too much? The answer to that question had come in the form of a colonel who'd approached her aircraft as she'd completed her shutdown procedures. He'd been tall, perhaps 45 years old, with the bearing of someone who'd spent his career in positions of significant responsibility. His uniform had been standard Air Force, but like the other personnel she'd seen, he'd worn no visible rank or unit insignia. "Captain Kestrel," he'd said as she'd climbed down from the cockpit, "I'm Colonel Morrison. Welcome to Groom Lake." Groom Lake. The name had been familiar, though she'd never expected to find herself there. It was the official designation for the facility that was better known by its unofficial name, Area 51, the most classified military installation in the United States, the place where experimental aircraft were tested, and where the boundaries of aerospace technology were pushed beyond anything the public knew existed. But even knowing where she was, she'd been unprepared for what Colonel Morrison had told her next. "Captain, you